When I first got my, book contract, the conception of the book was a bit different than what it ended up being. I've spent the last decade of my life in part, I've had sort of multiple parts of my career. I have a film out called Sugarcane, as well. Um, but I spent the last decade of my life as a reporter, a journalist covering Indigenous affairs primarily. So I traveled to Native communities all throughout Canada and the United States, reporting on what was going on in their communities and lives. And I always felt that that would be sort of the backbone of my first book, combined with some elements of memoir and family history, because the reason why I've been trying to tell native stories is that I've also been, looking out at the world to look within, to look out at the native world to understand, myself as someone who comes from two different worlds, as someone who comes from a people who also had our world taken from us, right? The cultures and languages and traditions and lands of my people were stolen. And there's a giant sort of act of recovery that I'd say all Indigenous peoples share in. The thing that happened, I think this is very common for people who write a book, is the book itself, changed in form and structure and conception as I was writing it. I always knew that there would be this strand of memoir that was holding together the whole text. I always knew that there would be these reported, sections on different, First Nations and tribes all across the continent, on different leaders, like the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, and was the first Native American cabinet secretary, for those who don't know. But what really sort of transformed was while I was writing We Survived the Night, I also directed a documentary called Sugarcane that was ultimately nominated for an Academy Award. It follows an investigation into abuse and missing children at the Indian Residential School. That's an assimilationist segregated boarding school that my family was sent to near Williams Lake, British Columbia. And because I was working on a documentary that also was very personal, I appeared in the film alongside my father and his mother, and focuses on my own nation, my own community. Because I was working on a film that was about essentially the system that wiped out or nearly wiped out our language and culture and our storytelling traditions, I started thinking very purposefully as I was writing We Survived the Night about what traditions as a storyteller, I felt the responsibility to try to bring back to life, in a sense, on the page. And so that led me to a few things. I mean, firstly, it led me to move in with my dad for 2 years while I was writing We Survived the Night and directing Sugarcane, the documentary, which was, quite the decision for a 28-year-old bachelor who, hadn't lived with his father since he was 6 years old. Now suddenly I was living across the room from the guy. I mean, we lived across the hallway from each other, and we would cook each other breakfast. He's an artist, so he'd be out in a studio making his art, and I'd be working on the documentary and writing my book during the day, which included spending time, reading some of these old anthropological sources, these old ethnographies that included some of my own people's traditions that have since, essentially died out. And at night we'd hang out, and I'd like throw the recorder on, and we'd just kind of, like, as people say, shoot the SHIT, and sometimes have a little smoke and play a game or whatever. And he'd just tell me stories from his life, and I'd tell him a little bit about mine, and I'd learned a lot more about him. We got a lot closer. He's probably my best friend in the world right now. I literally was just on the phone with him before we got on this interview. And what I came to understand was, especially as I was reading these stories in the ethnographies about the trickster coyote who was sent to the earth by the creator to set things in order, but was a trickster. So he did a lot of good, but he also messed a lot of stuff up, and who was one of our first ancestors. So he was kind of also our way of narrating who we are in a sort of honest, funny, critical kind of a way. I realized that as I was reading these old stories about the trickster coyote and then hanging out with my dad and hearing about his stories, that there was so much similarity between him and, the trickster ancestor of our people, Coyote, who helped the creator make the world, but also messed some stuff up along the way. And I think that parallel between the coyote stories and my father's story and my grandfather's story as I know it and my own story really led me to sort of reconceptualize what it was that We Survived the Night, my book, would be. And led me to, conceive of the book as an entire coyote story, essentially. So it is, in addition to having the memoir and family history and the reportage, it's actually all woven together around three of the sort of greatest hits, if you will, from the epic misadventures of our trickster ancestor, who I see very much reflected in my own life, in my father's life, my grandfather's life, the life of my family, and in the broader Indigenous world, because I think that this tradition still gets at so much of the truth of the world, because of course it does. It was developed over thousands of years to get at the truth of the world and the way things really are. So the first section of the book is structured around Coyote and his son, which is essentially the story of how the trickster was a lonely bachelor and wanted to not be so lonely anymore. And so he makes himself a son, and so he has a companion and that sort of a thing. Is that bothering you, by the way? Should I? No, the person over my shoulder. Okay. Um, so he makes himself a son because he's a lonely bachelor, and then they go on this, sort of epic father-son journey, and then eventually, the trickster grows envious of his son, and they have a little bit of a falling out. And it's sort of a story about um, father-son abandonment. Interestingly, it's an ancient story about father-son abandonment, which as I was reading this, because these are not stories that are told anymore in our culture. They mostly only exist in these old ethnographies. I've actually only literally heard somebody in my own family tell a coyote story once in my entire life. That is how close to death this entire tradition is. So I saw so much of myself and my dad in that. And then the second one is about it's called Coyote Steals a Salmon. It's about how in the beginning of time, the trickster finds himself, after having his falling out with his son, stuck in the fish trap of these two witches that are hoarding all the salmon at the mouth of the river for themselves. If you know anything about salmon, they swim up the river to spawn and die, Pacific salmon. And so he essentially he pulls a big trick on them, and because he's the trickster, and he liberates the salmon. He sends them up the river, and it's this essential part of the creation of our world, because to this day we derive something like half of our calories every year from salmon. I mean, in the Pacific Northwest, this is really the staple for not just Indigenous peoples. I mean, everybody eats salmon around here. And because he's a trickster, he also uses the salmon. I mean, it's a great thing that he's feeding us, but he uses it to his own advantage. So he takes the salmon and he goes to every village along the river and he says, "You can have salmon for all time, but you have to let me marry into your community." And so, he arranges all of these marriages all across the interior, and that is part of how we trace our lineage to coyote and our rights to the fish. And it also, illustrates an important law of the river, which is pretty basic, right? Like, don't catch all the fish, preventing all the people upriver from getting it. And it also, it's a story about, I would say, the dual nature of transformations in our world. I think that we're seeing that more and more every day. But this is a world wherein good things happen not necessarily entirely because of altruistic reasons, and sometimes our culture is, in a sense, and our gifts from the land are in a sense like stolen from the supernatural, is kind of the way that we think about these things as Indigenous peoples. And maybe there's also a little space for a trickery in the making of the world and in society. And I mean, hard to look out, just as an aside, at a world right now and say that it's not a world that is deeply shaped by tricksters and their tricks. And the last section is called Coyote Comes Back, which is basically about how our people have long held that in the end times, when the empires that have come to control our lands, start to crumble, that our ancestors would return and that the trickster would come with them. And very interestingly, there's actually an oral history that I encountered in my research about the first white man who my people met. this guy named Simon Fraser, who did this really foolish journey down what's now the Fraser River, actually, not very far from where I'm talking to you today, and nearly dies along the journey. Our people tried to persuade him not to do it because it is still to this day an unnavigable river. And in that foolish, act of discovery, I guess, he made our world, remade our world in a way that did actually, in fact, mark the end of the indigenous world as we knew it, the beginning of the end of our way of life, the loss of our land, eventually our children being taken away, our culture being imperiled, and, done by a man who his journey was actually considered a failure by his employer because it was not of benefit to the fur trade route that he was trying to establish. And yet, this is how our colonized world comes to be. Everywhere I've been across Indian country in Canada, as well as the United States, and around the indigenous world, I'd say so many of these traditions are coming back and coming back strong. And that is also, I think, in the final Coyote story about Coyote coming back, that is something that we said would happen, is that our ancestors' way of life would return. And that's very much something that I see happening across the indigenous world today. And, there's lots of different manifestations of that. It's in song, dance, language, so many different things. But, one of the ones that I am particularly drawn to, because my people are fish people, we eat fish, is fishing and relationships to, the water, which is an interesting one also, because we often think about colonization as being a land-based thing, as being something about the taking of land. But there's also, particularly if you're from the part of the world that my people come from, the resources that we derive from the waterways are also essential, right? Like that is how we fed ourselves all across the West Coast, and elsewhere as well. And so in the book, I heard about through another story. I mean, sometimes the way that these things happen, right, is that you're out there reporting one story. And so I was writing a story about Deb Haaland and how she was becoming the first Native American cabinet secretary, which had a lot to do with a lot of things, but in particular, the sort of key vote to make her the first ever Native American cabinet secretary came from an Alaska senator who was deeply influenced by Alaska Natives in her state. And so I was interviewing different Alaska Natives about that, and I came to understand that they were powerful political players in the politics of Alaska. In fact, Lisa Murkowski, the senator of Alaska, is adopted into a Tlingit clan, and that part of the reason why she feels so much fealty to Native peoples is that relationship of clan-based reciprocity. And so I was interviewing some of those people among the Tlingit, and they were telling me about this issue that they were having in Sitka, Alaska, of essentially a conflict over the herring, which are a little tiny fish that's kind of like it's kind of like a sardine, I guess. It's like a little silver forage fish that is eaten by salmon. So it's an important food source for the fish that I eat, which, by the way, the fish from the Fraser River go all the way up to the Gulf of Alaska. So they really are eating some of these guys. The salmon's migration path is crazy. And they were telling me about this ingenious method that the Tlingit and other coastal nations have for harvesting the roe, the eggs of the herring when they come into spawn. And essentially what they do is they cut down a small tree, usually in the Tlingit, they prefer to use a hemlock tree, and they submerge it in the shallow water to create an artificial spawning habitat for the fish. When they come drop their eggs, that the eggs will get dropped on the branches of these trees, because they usually drop them on kelp beds and rocks and that sort of thing. And so this does two things that are really ingenious. Firstly, it grows the potential spawning habitat for the herring, so it's actually good for the herring population. And it also allows the Tlingit to pull those herring trees out and then to, harvest and eat the roe that's on there, which I was like, that's an ingenious method. Oh, the other thing it allows them to do is also like, it allows them to potentially manage the herring population by moving, trees loaded down with eggs to different areas in the waterways, so that in the future, the herring will come back to those areas. It's a really brilliant method of managing this entire fish population that's an essential food source, and essential it's a keystone species in the entire food chain. And so I was totally amazed when they were explaining this to me, and then explaining me the conflict with them in the commercial fishing industry that just takes the fish and slaughters them and takes out their roe. That's a very wasteful kind of fishery. Um, and so I thought that I had to go see this, and had to go, set some trees and pull out the golden roe of the herring. And so I went and did that. And there's a whole chapter in the book that's about my time among the Tlingit in Sitka, Alaska, and the conflict over the herring there, and how it's illustrative of this broader sort of effort by Indigenous peoples to conserve our environment and our resources, and the conflicts that ensue with industries and commercial fisheries over that. But also how these traditions that have managed these fish populations for a very long time are kind of ingenious, and rarely get seen as a brilliant form of technology in a way. I mean, it became very clear to me that the central through line of the story of the book was ultimately going to be about me and my relationship with my father, and us. I moved in with him, as I said, for 2 years while I wrote We Survived the Night. And so I think that at the end of the day, a big part of what I was reckoning with is what it is to be Indigenous, which to me is a question that I inherited from my dad, and what it is to relate to a dad who left, but who you still love, and who was really broken by a very traumatic history of colonization that continued to shape his upbringing in very harmful, violent, tragic kinds of ways. And there's another figure who I write about in the book who was kind of a stand-in for a dad for me for a number of really sort of crucial years after my dad left, named Coco, who's also a Native man, who my mother was involved with. And so it became very clear to me that I needed to finish the story kind of where it began, with my relationship to these father figures, one my biological father, one kind of who played the role. And so I chose to go visit Coco on the White Mountain, Apache reservation, to see what forms of understanding and reconciliation might lie there. And also, I sort of end the story of how me and my dad, ultimately he decided to move out at the end of our sort of 2 years together, and that was kind of another painful uh, break in our relationship, not one that's caused us to not relate to each other anymore, but just another painful thing. And I try to also narrate these things through an understanding of in our oral histories, there's this kind of question of where does Coyote go? Where does he go at the end of the story? There's sometimes he dies and then resurrects, sometimes he disappears, never to be seen again, sometimes he gets transformed into a rock for whatever his latest no good tricksterly thing is that he's done. And so I sort of use those kinds of questions about where do these paternal figures, these mythic figures who've made our lives but who are complicated, where do they go at the end of the story, and how do we think about them? And ultimately the place I arrive at, maybe sounds kind of simple, but to me feels a bit profound, is to know someone's story, to have spent the time to really know them so well that you can narrate their story, the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful, the complicated, and how it has made you into who you are, is an act of love. And ultimately at the end of the day, one thing that colonization has absolutely deprived Indigenous peoples of has been love. We are not a loved people in the culture more broadly. And the kinds of dysfunctions and breaks within our own families that have been caused by these histories have also led to people not being loved. And I think for me to tell this story was ultimately it was an act of love for my dad, for Coco, for my people, and to say that, like, despite all of the awful things that have happened, the tragedy, the pain, and the ways that these things that some of these men have done have hurt me, that I still love them, and I love them who they are, because it's made me who I am.
Must have been a proud moment giving copies of this book to your family.
Yeah, I'm actually still in the process of doing that. The book comes out on October 14th, so I'm still sort of being the book delivery guy. Ironically, the first copies I got were the UK Commonwealth edition from Profile Books, so I've been giving people that one while I have it. But yeah, no, it's been really beautiful to see my dad in particular and members of my family respond to the book. He after reading it for the very first time told me that he understood and he said that he was sorry for what he did and how it hurt me, and that was way more than enough for me.